Morning, everybody. Clearly, I'm going to ask you how you're feeling. I'm not going to require you to share yet, but you will share, I hope. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm going to say up front that I was just in England until I flew in from England yesterday. And so if I collapse on stage, it's not because I don't think all of you are fabulous. It's because I just fell apart. I won't fall apart, but I might. No. Anyhow, so I was listening to the president, CEO of the American Psychological Association speak, which I think is important and powerful, and that interview was also fantastic. And what I want to say, just my brain is going in one direction, which is that, it's been 30, 40, 50 years, that we have been thinking about mental health in a serious way. And yet, when you look at the data, our children's and adults' mental health seems to be getting worse. And so I just have this dilemma as a psychologist, as a leader of a center that does work in the world, that we're talking so much about this. But what are we really doing, on a day-to-day basis to create systemic change? And so I have a little bit of knowledge in that space, and what I hope to share with you today is the work that we've done now in about 5,000 schools across the United States and in 27 other countries. I was in London working actually with the government to think about doing this nationally, and also here in the United States, as well as in countries like Italy, Spain, Australia, China, and the list goes on. And learned a lot just running around the world trying to get people to talk about their feelings. So before I jump in, I want to thank all of you for participating in that survey, because the 4 concerns that you shared, and I did this here's my analysis on a plane coming home. There were 4 themes. Number 1 theme that people said that was a concern right now was mental health. Number 2 was drugs and alcohol. Number 3 was lack of connection. And number 4 was the impact of social media. And so what I hope to do is, everybody should just know that's what's on everybody's mind in terms of what's happening. And I'll weave that into today's presentation. And for those of you who don't know, tomorrow afternoon I'm doing a workshop that's a lot longer workshop. And I asked all of you things like, what do you want to learn? Which with that list, I thought there were going to be themes there. There were 350,000 things that people want to learn. So I need today to prepare for that for tomorrow. All right. So if you've heard of the center's work, we have a tool we call the mood meter, el medidor emocional. So all of you woke up this morning. Some of you don't look like you're awake, but you woke up this morning and you're feeling something. And oftentimes, it's hard to really be specific about how we feel. We say things like fine, good, okay, right? How many of you say that regularly? Fine, good, meh. But that's not that helpful. And so we've built one tool. I'm going to share with you an exciting update about that tool in a minute to help be more aware. So -5 on the bottom. It says pleasantness. -5. In your brain right now, you're thinking to yourself something like this. I don't like this guy. I don't want to listen to some psychologist from Connecticut talk about feelings for 45 minutes. That's a waste of time. Is anyone there? All right, because I'm also a martial arts instructor, just so you know. All right. -3. Whatever. Neutral. Whatever that means. +3, you're like, oh my gosh, 45 minutes talking about feelings. +5. All right, I got 2 people in the front row. This is going to be the best day of my life. I'm not expecting that, but we'll get there. So give yourself a number right now, -5 to +5. What's going on in your brain? Do you feel like approaching the day, or do you feel like avoiding the day? Is this an environment where you're looking around and feeling safe and comfortable, or is this an environment where you're like, I'm not sure if I fit in here? Because that's what your brain is doing every single day. When you wake up in the morning, when you go to school, when you go to work, your brain is trying to make predictions about whether you're going to thrive or not. Not so much about calculus and science and all that other stuff. It's really basic. Will I thrive? Will I survive? Am I in the need of something for support? On the y-axis, it says the word energy. I can give you your feedback right now about your energy levels. -5, everyone's in their deepest pool of despair. Like, I want to go back to bed. +5, you're like, come on. Nobody's like, come on. All right, we got a lot of work to do here. So what's your energy level, everybody? +5, you can't contain yourself. -5, you're like, everyone get the idea here? Every day, we're kind of doing this kind of intuitive analysis. Am I pleasant? Am I unpleasant? Am I energized? Am I depleted? And then we have to make meaning out of that. So the easiest thing that I could do for you is put it into 4 quadrants: yellow, red, blue, and green. So pick a color right now. Where are you sitting today? Are you in the yellow, high energy and pleasant? Are you in the green? You're pleasant, but you're kind of low in energy. Are you in the blue? Low energy, unpleasant. Are you in the red? Unpleasant but activated. All right. Obviously, we can't walk around just saying, I'm in the yellow all day long. That's not helpful. We got to have language. So now I'm going to ask you to pick your feeling word or your feeling words. You could be feeling more than one. You got 3 seconds to find the precise feeling word. Freeze. Okay, quick raise of hands. I need honesty in the house. How many of you had some trouble finding the word? Hands up. Really high. Like stretch it out. Really, really, really high. Now freeze. Do not put it down. Please look around the room. So here we have people who are like, they're into this stuff, right? You're like into like mental health and psychology. Not all those other weirdos who didn't show up today. And you're struggling with finding the words. Think about that for a minute. How deprived we are of language to be self-aware. Now, we're here for 2 full days. How many of you are like, oh, that's a long time to focus on this stuff? I don't know about you, but I can barely get through 5 minutes on my own presentation. And so, like, what are your strategies? Like, what's going to help you be present? We're in California. That's the buzzword here, I hear. Everyone is present. I have no idea what that means, but that's what everybody says. I'm going to be present today. Raise your hand if you struggle being present. It's like impossible. So we need deeper strategies. And by the way, I'm going to spend more time on that tomorrow. So just so you know, there's a cheat sheet. You can learn to be more self-aware. This is just from my book called Permission to Feel. Here's your 100 words to get more granular and precise about your feelings. So you could be high, high yellow, like ecstatic or elated or jubilant or euphoric. You could be low yellow, happy, joyful. You could be green, calm, content, tranquil, peaceful, relaxed. You could be blue, down, disappointed, everything, hopeless, despair. You could be red, peeved, irritated, angry, enraged, or anxious or overwhelmed. There's so many words, but yet we tend to use only a few. And I think this behooves some discussion. And I think just a simple question, how are you feeling, is way more complex and complicated than people make it out to be. As a matter of fact, I can't even remember anybody ever asking me, Mark, how are you feeling? We say things like, how's it going? What's up? Or how are you? So I'm going to ask you to take 1 minute at your tables. What goes into being the receiver of that question? Like, think about it. When someone says, how are you feeling? What goes into your response? Take 1 minute, please, go. Ting. Okay, we don't have much time this morning, so I'm going to ask us to come back together. So I'm going to just use my front row here because it's easier. This group right here. What do you think? How are you?
We said, what did I say? I already lost it, not in Smasha. We said something about, I'm a teacher, I can project. We said something about, the responder, not the responder, the asker. So does that person have the bandwidth really for the answer? So is that really why they're not asking? Because when you say, how are you, that's just more safe. But when you say, how are you feeling? What are you going to get? And are you ready for that? Yeah. So we didn't even get into, we kind of got into maybe that's why people aren't even asking.
Yep.
And then we talked a little bit. We have some great youth ambassadors here. So we quizzed them and we said.
What did you guys say?
What did you say about it?
I basically said that sometimes people don't want to be honest with the answer because they don't know how the person asking the question is going to react.
So ask me how I'm feeling.
How are you feeling?
Good. Ask me again.
How are you feeling?
It's this odd mixture of I'm bloated from my breakfast. I'm tired. I'm overwhelmed. I'm excited to be here, but I'm also chronically full of despair and optimism. And she's like, why'd I come to this conference? So you can see here, right, that, by the way, how many of you feel that way sometimes? You got 15 feelings going on in your head. You're like, I'm excited, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm overwhelmed, I'm happy, I'm content. We're all over the place. We're not just these simple creatures. But yet, when it comes to asking that question, I've had parents say, I think I'm going to ask my kid how they feel in the morning. I got to go to work. So there are many layers to this that, we could dive more deeply into. It's trust. It's vulnerability. It's, do I even get asked the question? It's, does anyone want to hear the response? Are you willing to listen? Do we have the vocabulary? Will you support me? Do you even know what might be helpful for me? And so I just want to encourage you to just think about this a little bit more. Do you pause to ask someone that question, and do you listen to their response? Because here's what it looks like in the real world. Right now, in our national studies, this is the way kids report how they're feeling. We got a lot of frustration going on. We got a lot of boredom. We got a lot of anxiety, confusion. There's some pleasant emotions, but the majority of the words that people use, youth use, are not what we call pleasant feelings. I do a lot of work with educators. I just came from a conference last week in Chicago where we presented the results of a study with about 40,000 teachers over the last couple of years. And here's how they've been feeling. Does this relate to any of you educators in the room or anyone else? Back in the beginning of the pandemic, that's the word on the left, that's about 20,000 teachers, educators from across the US. Anxiety was the number one word. Anxiety has now turned into overwhelm. Now, the big question for all of you, because all of you are future emotion revolutionaries, that's what I'm obviously trying to create here, is do we even know the differences between concepts like anxiety and stress and frustration and overwhelm? I think in the last 5 years there's been 50 books published at minimum on anxiety and stress. And so are there differences? Does that matter? That's not a rhetorical question, by the way. So what do you think? Anxiety, stress, frustration, overwhelm. Oh my. Similar? Different? Raise your hand if you think they're pretty close, similar. How many of you think these are very different concepts? Raise your hand if you are, stand up, if you feel confident that you can give me an operational definition of all four of these. Isn't that amazing? I'm just asking you to define 4 words, but yet none of us are that confident in defining them. And if I were to make you work hard, I'd make you do this at tables, but because of time, I'm just going to cheat. So broadly speaking, when we talk about anxiety, it's around the perception of uncertainty. Broadly speaking, when we talk about stress, it's having a lot of demands, but not the resources. Frustration, there are obstacles. Overwhelmed, is you're just overcome by your feeling states. So think about it. I remember when the pandemic first hit and our university shut down, and I am married to a man whose name is Horacio, who I love for 28 years, and his mom came to live with us. Not because we invited her, but because the pandemic canceled all flights back to Panama. She came to visit us February 28th, 2020, and there were no flights back. And so talking about like an emotional intelligence expert needing strategies to deal with his feelings, it was really rough because we have a small home, and I don't like to work from home. I like to go to work. And having, my 80-year-old mother-in-law every morning staring at me, saying, "When are we having coffee?" I'm like, "When you make the coffee." Like, we have growth mindsets in this household. You can do it. I promise. You can do it. I want you to make coffee. I'm like, "I don't want to make you coffee." It got so rough one day that she looked at me and she goes, "Are you really the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence?" And I just looked at her and I said, "Not tonight." And the house blew up. It was rough. And I was trying to figure out, like, how am I feeling? And I wasn't really anxious. I wasn't really stressed. I was just overwhelmed. I was just like saturated. And when I realized I just needed some space, all my strategies were taken away from me. I'm a hot yoga guy. How many of us are doing hot yoga in the middle of a pandemic? Like a room with no ventilation, with everybody going this. Like, it just wasn't happening. And so and you really can't do that stuff at home. I'm like, "Mark, you're going to learn every single park that exists in your entire county." And that's what I did. I needed new strategies. Did anyone find that during the pandemic? Like, you had to be more creative with how you dealt with your feelings? Because all of a sudden, life changed. Now, we can also talk about how people want to feel. I think that's super important. We don't necessarily focus on that. We're always asking, how do you feel, but not how do you want to feel? So in my work with educators back in the last year, appreciated came up as number one. Number one right now among educators is calm. I think that's quite interesting. People just want to feel at ease. They want all that activation to be down. And look at this. Don't you think the strategies that you would use to support a friend, a colleague, a child, to feel appreciated, wouldn't they be so different from calm? Does this make sense, everybody? That knowing the emotion word is a pathway towards healthy regulation. Now, when you look at the mood meter, if you plot the national data, you got a lot of people live in the red and blue, and you got people who say they want to be in the yellow and green, which makes kind of sense. Although, let's be real here. It's hard to be in the yellow and green all the time. If there's one huge misunderstanding of the work that our center does, it's that you got to be in the yellow all the time. I see teachers do this all the time, like, "What are we going to do to be in the yellow?" I'm like, the world feels like it's coming to an end. Like, why are you pushing everybody to be in the yellow? I'm in the red and blue right now, and I need to feel safe and comfortable being there. Right? We call that the toxic positivity piece, right? Everybody's got to be in the yellow all the time. That's not realistic. It's also not being human. But yet, we know from research that experiencing a bit more yellow and green than red and blue is good for our mental health and our well-being. So the question is, what do we do about it? Well, I'm going to argue that it starts with a concept called permiso para sentir. So none of you know me that well, which is normal because I don't live around here. This moment, but I am a 50-year-old guy. I am married to a filmmaker named Horacio, and I am gay and Jewish. And I grew up in a little town in New Jersey with two parents who cared about me. However, they didn't have a lot of skill. They loved me. When I was being bullied horrifically in middle school, my mother would say, "Don't worry, honey, your mother loves you." I'm like, okay, I'm going to tell the bully who's banging my head in the bathroom that my mother loves me. That's going to be helpful. I don't think so. Now, I know this is a room filled with people interested in mental health and can be safe. I feel comfortable sharing this with you. I also had other experiences in my childhood that were far worse. So I am someone who was sexually abused between the ages of 5 and 10 years old. So from 5 years old to 10 years old, my parents' best friend, who lived 2 doors down from us, abused me. I never shared that abuse. Never. Not when I was a kid. Until one day, when I was 10 years old, I was sitting in the backyard of my home, and my mother's brother was there. His name is Uncle Marvin. Uncle Marvin was a middle school teacher by day and a band leader by night in New York State. Just so happens Uncle Marvin was writing a curriculum to teach kids about feelings. I mean, how weird is that? And we were sitting in my backyard when I was 10, and he looked at me like no other adult had ever really connected with me. And he said, "Hey, Mark, how are you feeling?" I don't know what it was. His facial expression, his body language, his vocal tone, his presence. But it was that moment that I decided to share what was happening to me. I hate my life. I'm scared. All these things came out. He didn't say things like my father used to say, because my father was a tough guy from the Bronx, New York. No matter what was happening as a kid, my father was, "Son, you got to toughen up." My mother, on the other hand, was very anxious and overwhelmed all the time, and she was always having her little breakdowns. And she would say, "Don't tell me the details, I can't handle it." But Uncle Marvin, when I shared what was happening, he just said to me, "We're going to get through this. I got you." Changed my life. Truthfully, it gave me a career. Purpose, meaning. I didn't know that till later in life. But as I reflected when I was in college about what I could do with my life, all I could think about was my relationship with my uncle and what he taught me. So now it's 2023, 40 years after I disclosed my abuse. And I've been wondering, how many people have an Uncle Marvin? You heard about that in the introduction today, that trusted adult. I have a specific way of thinking about these trusted adults. I call them the people who give us permission to feel, the people who allow us to be our true selves, where we can be vulnerable, where they listen without judgment. They're not fixers. They're just there for you. And so I asked all of you to complete that survey. Some of you did. Thank you for that. You can still do it. About a third to a half, just about 40% of us in the room here reported having that adult in our lives. And then I went a step further and I said, describe that person. Like, what are the characteristics? What are the top 3 dispositions and character traits? And here are your data. Good listener, empathic, non-judgmental, loving, kind, supportive, open, caring, honest, compassionate, understanding, patient, accepting. I'm going to tell you something. I've now done this survey with nearly 20,000 people across multiple cultures. These are always the top 3. I just gave a speech in Costa Rica. I asked the people in that conference, describe your Uncle Marvins. Empathic, good listener, non-judgment. So here is your little reflection for 30 seconds, and then you can do it for the rest of your life. What's getting in the way? What's getting in the way of all of us being better listeners, being less judgmental, and demonstrating empathy and compassion? 30 seconds. Please, talk with your neighbors. Okay, everybody, let's come back together. I apologize for interrupting. So I'm going to call on that table right there. And you can skip. I don't want to make anyone feel like pressured. But we're going to go around the table. And I just want to know what came to mind for you. What was the barrier to being an Uncle Marvin? Which, by the way, we have a lot of Aunt Marias here. There's a lot of women in this audience. So I don't want to bias it. Please, what came to mind for you? What gets in the way? Fear. Stress. Not knowing what to do. Responsibility. Fear, stress, time, responsibility. It's funny, I do a lot of presentations to families, and I have parents fill this out. And the same thing happens, and I say, what's getting in the way of you as a parent? Because, by the way, only 5% of my participants say it was their parent. That's crazy. And parents say things like, I don't have the time to be an Uncle Marvin. I'm afraid to literally ask my kid how they're feeling, because if I hear something that I don't know what to do about, I'm going to freak out. My favorite one recently was this mom stood up. She's like, oh my God, this is so important. I said, thank you. And she goes, my daughter, I'm sure she has an Uncle Marvin. I'm positive. My son, though, I need to find him an Uncle Marvin. My goal is to find my son an Uncle Marvin. And in front of 500 people, I'm like, it could be you. She wasn't that appreciative of that, but. Now, there are reasons why all of you should care about this, and none of them are from my stories. It's from the data. So my day job is I'm a scientist. My center publishes 20, 30 papers a year, diving deeply into the science of emotion and emotional intelligence. In my book, this chapter where I talk about why emotions matter, it has 800 scholarly references. There is just no argument, period. How we feel is a driver of almost everything that matters in life. It matters for our attention. Now, you're looking at me now as a professor at Yale University. I never imagined being a professor at Yale University. I was a failing student, C&D student in middle school, failing classes. And truth is, look at me. I'm standing here. I'm really freaking smart. I'm a smart guy. But my brain was not available for learning. I was in survival mode. I'm not in learning mode. I don't want to hear what you have to share with me. I'm worried about being beaten up on the way home from school. I'm worried about being abused. I'm worried about being neglected. How can I focus when my brain is preoccupied? We know that now. That's why these Uncle Marvins are so important in our lives, because the mere presence of that person deactivates our nervous system. Emotions matter for our judgment, our decisions, our relationship. Has anyone here ever lived with or worked with someone who is really difficult? Just really hard to be around. They're always la la la. It's difficult to be around people who don't have strategies to deal with their feelings. I have a cousin like that. I love her, but it drives me out of my mind. I used to live in this country town, and she'd come to visit me, and I'd be like, gosh, I don't know if I could ever move back to the real world. And she's like, yeah, it's nice here, but there's an underlying anger. And I'm like, yeah, I'm looking at it. People are really nice here. So it's hard to be around people like that. This whole conference is about physical and mental health. I don't need to convince you with the data. The fourth is creativity and goal alignment, goal attainment. Think about this. Some of the most creative people don't achieve their dreams because they can't deal with the feedback. They can't deal with the anxiety, the stress, the overwhelm, and obviously academic performance. So I have a vision that we can create a world filled with emotion scientists versus emotion judges. Who were you raised by? Were you raised by somebody who was open and curious and reflective, who views all your feelings as information, who's always investigating and learning, who wants to get specific and help you label your feelings, who helps you develop a growth mindset about how you deal with your emotions? Or were you raised by the people that I primarily work with? The emotion judges. I gave a speech at my university recently to a department of medicine, and this one doctor stood up after my talk. He's like, "What happened to our university?" I'm like, "Really? That's your response to my presentation?" That's what I'm thinking anyway. And he goes, "Mark, we produce Nobel laureates, not kind people." I'm like, "We'd have a lot more Nobel laureates if you didn't work here." It was like, whoa. And I just said, "Does anyone else have a different perspective?" And someone else stood up and said, "Here's what I learned, Mark. Sometimes you just have to be a..." Because then the people who report to you just shut up and do what you tell them to do. I looked at the chair of this department. I said, "Are we making a movie here? Like, is this like my test of emotional intelligence? Like, this is crazy." Now, I know the people who work in this department. I'm here to tell you, they don't want to go to work. Nobody wants to work with people who are emotion judges. It just makes it's unsafe. It's uncomfortable. You can't be your true self. So that leads to the skills. So ruler is a set of skills that are all learned. I'm going to repeat myself. You are not born with these skills. I don't know anybody who's born with an area of their brain that is filled with evidence-based strategies to deal with emotions. I don't know anybody who's born with a brain that has a rich emotion vocabulary. Just letting you know that. You have to learn this stuff. And it can be learned from very early times. And by the way, it's a continuous learning experience. My father, who had a lot of anger problems, at 79 years old, my mom had passed away. He was married to another woman. She called me. She's like, "I'm leaving your father. I can't take it anymore." I'm like, "Oh, no. That means he's going to live with me." And so I take a road trip up to Binghamton, New York, where my father is, and we go to the local Panera coffee shop, drinking our decaf. I'm like, "Dad, what's going on?" "I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore." I said, "What can't you take anymore? You know, like, you're 80 years old. Like, let it go." He's like, "Jane is spending all this time with her grandchildren." "Oh, tell me more." So, long story short is I realized that my father was not really angry. He was jealous. He was jealous that his wife was giving attention to her grandchildren, not to him. So I now tell my father, "You know what, Dad, it sounds like you're jealous." And he's like, "Are you telling me I'm jealous?" I'm like, "No, you're telling me you're jealous. I'm just giving you the word for the feeling." And then he started crying because he started realizing what he was really feeling. And when we labeled his feeling, we then had strategies to talk about. What can you do? Jane has the right to be with her grandkids. So what are you going to do to fill that space? At 79, his wife called me a month later. She's like, "I don't know what happened at that Panera, but like, he's a changed man." I'm like, this is the work. Recognizing emotions, being really self-aware. What's going on in my body? What's going on in my brain? What quadrant am I in? Understanding emotions. That anger is a feeling of injustice. But what's so important about that is that I'm seeing so many different people in this room who have different lived experience than I have. What makes you angry and what makes me angry can be completely different things. We have to have the common language, though. We have to know that the feeling of anger is around injustice. But we have to be those Uncle Marvins who are non-judgmental and empathic and good listeners to learn what is the theme of your anger. That's the only way we're going to help people change and help support each other. Labeling with precise words, having that language. That example, anxiety, stress, frustrated, overwhelmed, I gave that to 100 CEOs just about 5 months ago. No one could define them. Not one of the CEOs could define the differences. The number one thing they said when I said, "What's the difference?" There is no difference. It's not a trick question. Expressing emotions. Knowing how and when to express emotions with different people across different contexts and cultures. There are lots of cultural differences in the way we express emotions. There's no right way to express emotions. Right? Eye contact in one country means something else in another country. I give a talk in New York City. "Hello, Dr. Brackett." I'm like, I need some testosterone for this presentation. It's like, whoa, this is like serious. I go to South Korea. Mark-san. Totally different expression. A greeting is totally different. Is there a right or wrong greeting? Of course not. But we go in with a very kind of ethnocentric way of seeing things. We think that the way we were taught to greet people is the right way. And when we become emotion scientists, we realize that there is no right way. There's only curiosity. My theory is that if we're in endless learning mode, we're going to do well. The minute we come into knower mode, that's when things go awry. So tomorrow in the afternoon, I'll go real kind of deep dive into these skills and strategies. I hope I'll see you there. I know I only have about 2 hours left. Just kidding. I'm thinking we're almost lying down in his chair, so I'm good. So I spent the last, 30 years of my life running around the world trying to get people to do this work. I started with my Uncle Marvin. So truth is, I was in therapy when I graduated from college because I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I was lost. And in that therapy session, there was a book on self-help that I started reading, and it started talking about emotions. And I had this epiphany that all the things that were now being talked about in psychology around emotional intelligence and social and emotional development, wow, like that's what Uncle Marvin was doing with me when I was a kid. So I pulled my uncle out of retirement, and we wrote a book together back in the day, 1998, that nobody should read. However, we had a great time doing it. And we tried to get people to adopt this as a practice. And we failed. We failed. Because the adults who were raising and teaching children were not prepared to do it. We were asking teachers to teach concepts like anxiety and stress and fear and overwhelm and despair and optimism and hope. But one teacher said, my mother was anxious, I'm anxious, I don't want to talk about anxiety. I don't want to do it. I said, but we have to do it. We've got to find a way to do it. So we started working with the teachers themselves. We had more success, but then teachers would come up to me on break and say, Mark, my principal's already told us that we can't implement this until after the state tests. I'm like, it's August. The state tests are in May. Like, this is ridiculous. So we had to work with leaders. And then I got invited to do a talk in New York City, and the chancellor of education was there. And she looked at me, she goes, Mark, I want this in all my schools. I'm like, all your schools? Like, there's 1,600 schools, 1.1 million kids. Like, I'm Willie Loman. I'm like the death of a salesman. I'm like walking around with my little suitcase trying to get people to talk about their feelings. Like, I can't. How am I going to reach 1,600 schools? And so we started really thinking about how to do this in a systems level. And I'm going to wrap up by just giving you some thinking around that. The first is we got to work on our mindsets. You got to get people on the bus. If people aren't on the bus, you're not going to get anywhere. I promise you that. I've tried this. 5,000 schools I've worked in. If people don't believe that emotions matter, you don't go anywhere because they're not willing to do the work on themselves. The second is you got to work as the aims piece. You got to deepen the skills. You can't just focus on the individual, though. As you heard from the CEO of the APA, you got to focus on the climate, the culture of a school. How do people feel when they walk in that building? And then it's got to be part of the immune system. There has to be accountability for the work. It's got to be in the school, like expectations that we teach this work. Just like we have expectations for reading and writing and arithmetic, we need expectations for social and emotional learning. So, what does it look like? Well, remember that hope for feelings? That woman is Dawn. She's now the superintendent of Harlem Public Schools and has been working with me. She's a former student of mine who now is in charge of 31 schools across the entire area of Harlem, New York. This is when she was a principal. Her teachers wanted to be inspired and peaceful and fulfilled and safe and pleasant and appreciated. What do we do to make that happen? How do we, as the adults running schools, ensure that our teachers are experiencing the emotions that they want to feel each day? And then how do you do that at the classroom level? Building that mood meter tool, having the language, doing mood meter check-ins on a regular basis in schools, finding out how students are feeling and the strategies they can use to manage them. Here's an example of children with learning differences. How do you get kids to talk about their feelings when they can't speak? That's an equitable challenge, an equity challenge. Look at this, artwork. Look at this, That's in Mexico. They made a football field out of the mood meter. This is a young girl reading a poem that I'll show tomorrow. Tools to help you be your best self. Let me ask all of you to reflect on this quote. Between stimulus and response, there is space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. That's a quote from Viktor Frankl, who wrote a very well-known book called Man's Search for Meaning. Think about that space that we now have between our stimulus and our response and how short it's gotten. We developed a tool we call the meta moment to help people build that space. This is one of my favorites. This is a boy, 4th grade boy in Seattle Public Schools, and his best self, according to his values and what he wants for himself, which is the way we define it, is to be kind, hardworking, selfless, and determined. So I'm a scientist. I run into a classroom like, selfless? You got to be kidding me. Like, what 4th grader is talking about being selfless? So I go up to this little boy and I'm like, I say that's your picture over there, and you read the word selfless. I'm curious. What made you choose that word? This is the best. He goes, sir, I've determined that the world is becoming narcissistic. I'm like, okay, tell me more. He's like, I am making a commitment to be selfless. I'm like, okay. Thank you for being my teacher. Imagine when you get activated by a peer and you pause and think of yourself as being someone who is kind and hardworking and selfless and determined, how the outcome might be different. Tools like the blueprint to help us problem solve. So much to go on. Just to share with you the overarching model, it's adults first, then students throughout the entire school, and then outside of school and families. Last thing I'll share right now is that we've now done plenty of research. We have more research going on to show that this work makes a difference. My colleague just published a meta-analysis of 400 studies showing that all the things that we think social-emotional learning can do, it does do. Less bullying, better relationships, stronger academics, better culture and climate. So let me ask everyone to take a nice long inhale and a nice long exhale. I shared briefly that mood meter is a big part of our work. One of the things that came out of the pandemic that was really cool was that I got to meet the founder and CEO of Pinterest. He read my book and he reached out to me and said, would you like to work together to make something really creative that we can make available for free across the world? I said, yeah, I'm interested. So we spent 2.5 years building a new app that we just won an award from Apple. It's now available on iOS and Android as of this week. We just got the Android version out. So you can look it up there. It's called How We Feel. It's free. It takes the mood meter. It gives you 244 words to describe your feelings. You can then describe what's going on for you or do a voice memo. You can track your feelings, and it has built into it 36 research-based strategies to help you manage your feelings. So please check it out. Just want to say also, if you're interested in doing this work at your school, you can just go to our website to learn more about that. I'll send out these slides for free. All right, last slide. Everyone take a nice long inhale and a nice long exhale. So raise your hand if you're going to give yourself the permission to feel all your feelings. All right, that's not bad. We're getting there. How many of you are going to strive to be that emotion scientist? Curious explorers as opposed to critical judges. I need hands, not just nods. I want hands. I want act. Okay, good. I want you to remember that emotional intelligence is not about feeling good all the time. That's not possible. It's about learning how to use all of our emotions wisely to achieve the goals that we have for ourselves and others in our lives. This is life's work. I hate to tell you that. I'm going to encourage all of you to be the role model. I have failed horrifically at dealing with my feelings. I have to tell you, it is not easy to deal with your feelings. My partner, my husband, Horacio, and I, when we get into a fight, and I'm like, he's like, oh, so you're taking a meta moment, huh? You're regulating. I'm like, yeah. He's like, you really want to say something mean and hurtful right now? I'm like,
Yeah. He's like, but you're not gonna because you're using your strategies. I'm like, oh shit, I need strategies for my strategies. Like, this is hard. So just embrace the complexity. And I'll just end by saying, I wish I had, a magic pill. I don't think there is a magic pill. I just think that we have to put all the effort that's needed into developing this side of the report card, which we call emotional intelligence. And while I can't be, I wish I could just give you all, like, here's your emotional intelligence, here's your emotional intelligence. I can't do that. But my hope is that my presentation at least got you thinking about the value and importance of these skills, and maybe it was a great place to start. Thank you so much for your time.